Interesting enough, it's kind of when things are going good. I was playing in a band. I love the music. I had a 1965 GTO convertible, and I had a beautiful girlfriend. And it was all of a sudden you had nothing, and that was kind of a rude awakening.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to my Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. Today, I am joined by a special friend I've known for many years. We used to work together and play together and all that stuff. And he's one interesting guy. A couple years ago now, he was on this show and he did 2 episodes about his career in music and a little bit about his time in Vietnam. And with the way things are, 250 years, a lot of reflection on the military, at least from my point of view. And I want to keep that going. Art has many, many interesting stories, and what he went through is amazing and survived it somehow. Art, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Why don't we start probably just before you went into the service? You went into the Army, and
Mhm.
I think that's a good place for us to begin.
And I think it was probably winter quarter 68. I got mono. I was playing in a band, and in order to pay for band equipment, I was working 6 days a week, every day after classes at the U. I was taking a full load, I think 18 credits at the time. I think 13 credits was the minimum you had to take to maintain your deferment. And I got mono. And I could not go, I'm sorry, that was fall quarter. I could not go winter quarter of 68 because of that. That happened in fall 67. I was going to go to summer school, and I didn't feel like it because the band got a job up in Lake Mille Lacs at a resort playing for teens on Wednesday nights, Friday nights, and Saturday nights. And by the luck of the draw, the two members of the band had a family cabin 15 minutes away. So I didn't want to go to summer school. So my mom called the University of Minnesota, some kind of a military attache office, and they said, "Oh, with proof, you can get a medical deferment." I said, "Okay, cool. Then I can play up there." So we played that for summer. It was a great summer. And another time we'll talk about the small plane crash we went through up there, but that's another story. Anyway, so I enrolled fall quarter 68. And that's when I met my first love, Sheila. I won't say her last name for her privacy, that fall. And I came home one day from school and there was a letter from the draft board. And I just figured it was my deferment. So I let it sit up on top of the dresser probably until middle of October. And I got up one Saturday morning and decided to open up, and whoa, it wasn't a deferment. They were drafting me. So I went to my mom and dad, and they said, "Well, we'll call and apply for that health waiver on the college credits thing." So they called the draft board, and the draft board's one sentence reply was, "What deferral? There was no such thing." So faced with the choice of either going to Canada and never coming home, or going to prison and being beat up or male raped, it's hard to believe, but going to Vietnam was the lesser of three evils. So on December 8th, 1968, I reported down to the induction center on Third Avenue. It's called the Federal Building on Third Avenue South and Washington Avenue, and that started my journey. Interesting enough, it's kind of when things are going good. I was playing in a band. I love the music. I had a 1965 GTO convertible, and I had a beautiful girlfriend. And it was all of a sudden you had nothing, and that was kind of a rude awakening. When we were growing up, if you had a bad Wednesday, whatever, you could say to yourself, your friends, "Hey, we're going to go out to Danceland Friday night," or "Hey, you're going out with Susie on Saturday night." Here it was, well, in 2 years, maybe if you live, something might happen. So it was a shock.
So this is December of 1968. We should point out a lot of these landmarks you're pointing out are in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and where you grew up. Class of 65, were you
Yeah,
in high
Romsdale
school?
class of 65. An interesting sidebar is that Romsdale High School had, I think in my junior year, 64, 5,000 kids. We were spread across the Star Tribune, a cover with a pram being the biggest site in high school. Our senior year, they split our class into two, and class of 65 first from Cooper, and then the rest of us who stayed at Robbinsdale. And interesting, I think there was somewhere between maybe 12 to 1,400 Cooper and Robbinsdale graduates who graduated. So if you do simple math, let's make say it was 1,400, 50% male, 50% female. That means there was probably about 700 males of draft age. Of course, now some are going to be deferment, blah, blah, blah. But of all of those guys that went, we only lost 3 to death. Everybody else came home. Just pretty miraculous. I mean, if you went into a war and said, here you have 1,700 troops, you're coming home with 3 casualties, you'd be elated with those numbers. And I'm not just meaning that their deaths were any less loss. I'm just saying from a typically number point of view, Romsdale High School, though we contributed a lot, it's pretty lucky in the guys that got to come home.
So now you're going to boot camp. What was that like? You hear boot camp, but if you've never been through it, maybe you can share that with us who did not go to boot camp.
Well, the first thing, hardest to get thing was adjusting the way you lived. I mean, there was no more pizza. There was no more watching TV at night. There was no music. I mean, there was nothing but army. And I think it was the first month in boot camp they kept you isolated. You could not go up. You couldn't have any, if you're caught with candy bars or any kind of junk food or anything like that, you didn't want to face the consequences. Extra duty, KP, harassment, whatever. But the one thing you didn't want to do is have anybody know your name, really. Okay. Because they could be standing on a formation and all of a sudden an order come down. Hey, we need you guys to go, blah, blah, blah. Our dean. Okay. Wouldn't even see me. So anonymity was a good thing. Okay. So that was an 8-week course and a lot of interesting things. They trained you basically, taught you military law, how to fight, target practice, canard throw, bivouacking, all kinds of stuff. And it was interesting. On the last event we went through, they had built a mock Vietnam village with stuffed hats and pop-up targets and explosions around you that wouldn't hurt you, but said, hey, that explosion went off 3 feet away from you. It was just a little charge to keep you moving and teaching you how to die. So,
Would you say it was invaluable for when you did get over to Vietnam?
perfect point. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. The difference between classroom training and on-the-job training. I wound up after Fort Campbell, and we'll go back to Fort Campbell after basic training. I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma to be trained for artillery. When you graduated, they put everybody out front and they would read your name off and your MOS, which was your pending job description. If you're going to be a radio man, they're sending you to a fort where they're going to teach you your radio skills, whatever it was. The one thing you didn't want to hear was 11 Bravo, Fort Polk, Oklahoma. 11 Bravo was infantry, Fort Polk was swamps. Now, we all pretty much knew, most of us, except for maybe the enlistees, were going to Vietnam, but you didn't want to go as an infantryman if you could avoid it. So when they yelled out 13 Alpha 10, I didn't know what it was. It could have been cleaning outhouses for all I cared. And Fort Polk, there was no swamps. I said, oh, that's great. So whatever I'm going to do is be better. So I wound up going to artillery school there. I get to Vietnam. And actually what probably saved my life is there was a free day, which you couldn't do anything. We were off, nothing to train you for in the AIT. And I heard from some of the cadre who I'd become friends with that don't sit in the bunkhouse or don't sit in the hall because they'll come and get you to do a crap job. So it wasn't really a day off. There was nothing to do. So they said that you could volunteer for heavy artillery school. I said, well, that sounds cool. I'll go see that. Get out in the country. It was beautiful. So I went out and took heavy artillery, which probably saved my life because we were more protected than the smaller artillery units. But when I got to Vietnam, my first fire mission at the Quan Loy near An Loc, I got my earplugs in like they taught me in advanced training. You always wore your earplugs. So I'm new guy there, so I'm grunting ammunition and artillery, 200-pound artillery shell from the safe bunker out to the pad where they're firing. And I have my earplugs in. When I went in for the second or third round of picking something up for the firing, there was an old sergeant in there. He might have been a Korean War veteran. And he kind of stopped and he pointed at my ear. So I took my earplugs in and said one thing to me. How the hell are you going to hear the incoming with your earplugs in? Because they're firing back at us and you couldn't hear it coming in if it exploded next to me. I never wore my earplugs again. So that's the difference between classroom training and on-the-job training.
Sure. Practical. The
Yeah.
veteran helped you.
Yeah.
So you said An Loc is where you were?
An Loc was very prominent at the end of the war because it was kind of a cork for the infiltration from the north down through Laos and Cambodia. And Quan Loy there was a base camp, which was, you may as well been home city. You didn't carry weapons in base camp. They were usually in Saigon area, or big, huge cities. You had tons of guards around them. I mean, they were never attacked except for occasional rocket attack. Then you had what you called fire support bases, okay? And those were out in the middle of a conflict area. And my particular artillery unit had 2 8-inch and 2 175s. And we were protected by usually a company of infantry around us because the first thing you didn't want is those big guns falling in the enemy's hands. So from that standpoint, it was better. I was lucky I took that heavy artillery training that day because instead of being airlifted by a helicopter and dropped in the middle of a swamp, I'm in a fairly secure. Now we took rocket fire and we took fire, so it wasn't like but and Quan Loy was the fire support base protecting the city of Anlock. And then from the fire support bases, you went out to fire bases. And usually what that was, maybe a 100 square circle with maybe a squad of army with you, 1 8-inch and 1 7/5 inch, and that was it. There was maybe 30 of you there, and usually was an area where they had cleared out, and you'd sandbagged and you put up your claymores and everything. And those were the fire bases. And then from there, you might occasionally have be sent out on individual missions into the bush, but not very often.
Now, you had told me stories before where you were driving a truck, and what was the purpose of that artillery?
It's kind of a little different today to talk about this now that it's legal, but I used to tell a story about how marijuana saved my life. At some point before Thanksgiving of 1969, my battery, through either wrong information received by the FO, Forward Observer, who was out there in the bush in disguise calling these artilleries, didn't give us the azimuths and the angle and where they wanted the fire to hit. And then they would say, okay, go 2 clicks to the left, and you would adjust your telefire. Okay. Well, either the information he came in was wrong, or the information that was transferred to us was wrong, or the information was entered wrong. And we wound up firing out of where we should have, and we hit a friendly village, and we killed, I don't know how many women, children, and kids. It was very, very hard thing to deal with. And I got a moral kick and said that I couldn't work on the guns anymore because of that. And so they were going to court martial me. And I talked to some guy or some officer, lieutenant or something before all this. I mean, it's weeks away, months away. And he said, so you won't work in the, I said, I didn't say that. I just said I wouldn't work on the guns anymore. I can't kill civilians and children like that. I can't deal with that. And he said, well, that doesn't mean you do another job in the Army? I said, yeah, I'm here. What am I going to do? I want to go home, so I want to finish my tour. So he was pretty cool. They dropped the charges and they put me into the Army's way of retribution, put me into motor pool driving 200-pound and 170-pound, 150-pound projectiles and powder across mined roads. So on one particular mission, we were delivering out to fire. We were in Quanway, which is a fire support base. We were delivering supplies and ammunition to Fire One or something like that, little bases. Okay. And when we got there, we were no more there and they were under attack. So we couldn't leave on time. And usually I'd have a machine gunner in the bed of the truck. It was a 2.5 2.5 ton truck. And I'd have a sidekick gunner when I drove for protection. Well, we didn't have the machine gunner that time. I don't know why we didn't have him, but he did show up. So I only had this. He was a Puerto Rican guy from New York, nicest guy. He was running my point guard with an M16. So we got late getting out of the fire support base to get back into base camp, fire support base for the fire base. And we're driving back in, and this is basically a logging road. And they've cleared the brush of the jungle back maybe 50 yards on both sides so that they can't sit by the roadside and ambush you. They're going to have to do it from 50 yards away. So Echeverry was a Puerto Rican's name. So I'm driving back in and I'm doing all I can, going fast as I could because we're getting near to dusk. We don't have the password to get in because we were supposed to be back like at 2 or 3 in the afternoon and the sun's starting to go down. And we don't want to be out there at night by ourselves with 2 M16s. So I'm driving along and he starts to chop a beer. Well, the truck's jumping up and down like this, and I'm going to keep it on, and he's spilling all over. Slow down. I said, we can't slow down, man. We got to go. So he throws the beer out the window. He said, do you mind if I smoke some pot? I said, no, go ahead, because that was something he could do. So he lit up the joint, and he's smoking it, and all of a sudden he taps me on the shoulder and to hand me the joint. And I said, oh, what the hell was that? But in order to take the joint, I had to take a hand off my steering wheel to control the car, so it meant my foot off the accelerator, slowing the vehicle down. As I reached to my right and looked for him to get the joint from him, I saw the puff of smoke come out of the tree line. And here comes a rocket. And it went right over us, about 10 feet in front of us. If I had not taken my foot off the end, I wouldn't be talking to you today. So we wound up getting back in. So
That's incredible.
Yeah, so that's why I say pot saved my life. And
Yeah,
as we talked in previous episodes, I said that before. When I came home, there was three things that saved my life. Pot was the first. Getting back into music and the Panasonics and the love of my life was the third. In Vietnam, we talked about this earlier about it. There were three groups of people: the professionals, what we call them lifers. Okay, they were career. Okay, of course, at that time we didn't particularly like them, but they were just doing their job. As I look back now, there were the alkies, the ones who would come in every night and get drunk, and then there were the druggies, of which I was one. I didn't do any hard drugs, but there was all the way up to morphine was being used over there because it was the only way you could cope with what was going on. So we had come back in from a mission. I was driving now. And of course, get back in. Somebody said, "Hey, I got this new album by CTA." I said, "Well, who's CTA?" Chicago Transit Authority. You're horny. Yeah, let's go hear it. So all the alkies would go to the bar. The professionals and careers would go wherever they went, mostly officers and enlisted NCOs. And the potheads would all get together. And we lived underground in a hooch. So we go down to listen to this album, and of course the pot's flowing smoothly. Now, interesting in Vietnam to keep troops from ratting or hurting each other. In order to be busted for marijuana in Vietnam by the army, you had to have it in your hand. It couldn't even be in your pocket, as I remember, because you didn't want people planting pot on people to get rid of a person who when you needed a body. Okay. So we're sitting down there listening to CLT and cleaning our M16s, and in comes a 90-day wonder. Never saw him before in my life. And you could tell by the way he walked in, crispness and brand new clean starched uniform, looked like he hadn't sweat a day in Vietnam yet. So he comes in and of course, immediately come to attention. He goes, "What's that? Who's smoking marijuana?" Nobody said anything. And some stupid guy who was cleaning his M16 let the chamber slide like he was loading a load. Of course, there were all the stories about fragging officers and this stuff from Vietnam. No, I never saw it, but we heard it. And this guy panicked and he left out, and we all broke up and headed back to our private hooches. And they somehow found out who we were and they gathered us all up. And this time, the Army's wisdom wasn't as good as when they took me off the guns. They broke us up and sent us to same battalion, but to different fire support groups. Luck of the draw, I went south of Saigon into a pacified area. There's nothing going on down there. It was just quiet. So this time the Army's punishment backfired. And so I got to spend a few months. That was after typhus and after the wound across my neck.
Okay, so you've told me a few stories. Viewers and listeners were with Art Dean, Vietnam veteran, and he is retelling some of the things that happened to him in Vietnam. You told me that you were hospitalized over there. What happened?
Well, when I first got to Vietnam, it was the dry season, and we lived underground. Okay, you dig a hole in the ground, you take metal and build up sandbag sides and put metal sheeting over that, and then top that with 3 or 4. So when the rockets came in, they wouldn't pierce and get into our living quarters. And being a bunch of guys living together, it was a pigsty. Of course, most guys, you didn't give a damn. And when I got there, it was hotter. Heck, no air conditioning, no fans, nothing. And you'd sleep at night in a second bunk, and everybody's using their mosquito netting. I thought, why are you using mosquito netting? There's no mosquitoes, and that would stop what little airflow there was to coming in. So I didn't use my mosquito netting. And one night, when they were firing, particularly mission, I was off this particular night, they were firing right over us. And when they fire those big guns over the whole area would shake. And of course, it was a dirt floor, and the red dust would come up, and you could barely see across the room. So I'm laying on my back. It was very hard to get to sleep there. I'm laying on my back, and boom, wakes me up. I'm laying there. My chest felt really heavy. I thought, what the heck? And when I moved, it moved. And it was a big rat. And he ran right up over my face, through my hair. And when he went by, he cut my lip right here. I didn't think anything of it. About 2 days later, I'm sweating. I got a temperature. I reported to the medic on base, and he took my temperature. It was 103. It's 100 degrees out. And so he said, "We're going to medvac you out." Put me on some morphine, medvac me out. This would have probably been June. I hadn't been there very long. And they medvac me down to Long Bin, which is a very safe area, and started to test me for malaria. And they didn't know what I had. They couldn't find malaria. And I was getting sicker and sicker. And so finally at night, they would wrap me in like a diver's rubber suit and they would put me in a metal bathtub and pack ice cubes around me to keep my temperature down so they could find out what was wrong with me. And this doctor would come in. When I landed, I was out of morphine. They moved me in. They were going to immediately put me into that room, and all of a sudden there's this buzzer go off, and they're flying in dozens of wounded, and it was blood everywhere. It was just it's horrible. And so I had this doctor would come in every day in the morning to look at my chart, my temperature, and blah blah blah. And and he looked like he'd been through hell. I mean, you can kind of a surgeon in that kind of area, amputations and dead. And he looked like he was near his end of his tour, his duty. And as it turned out, he was, but I didn't know that. And he would come in every day, stand at the bed. In the morning, I'd feel pretty good after my temperature being lowered, but by lunchtime, I'm out of it again. And he said this morning, he said, I know you got malaria. We just can't find it. Thinking to myself, well, I had college biology. If it's affecting my blood, you should be able to find it there. So I went back to sleep, and I woke up the next morning by a new doctor because that doctor had gone home, bless his heart. And the new doctor looks at my chart. He says, you got the plague. You got typhus. He said, I'm going to test it for you right away. So they tested me for it, and I had it. They started me on medication. And I can remember the first day when I got out of stupor or hallucinations, because I got out of bed for the first time in probably about 30 days and to take a shower. Okay, there were no air conditioning. They did have big fans, which helped, but there was no air conditioning. So as I'm walking in the shower, showering, this guy says, well, what do you think about them landing on the moon? Landing on the moon? He said, yeah, they landed on the moon yesterday. I said, I was in and out of sleeping. I said, I thought that was a movie. So when one step for mankind, I was in the hospital in Saigon. Where, interesting enough, I then went up to Cameron Bay for R&R, 6cc it was called, 6 recovery unit, where they get me back into shape. And I mean, I'd lost a lot of weight. And I was very thin, but I felt great. I didn't feel weak. So the first day out for calisthenics, all right, we're going to do some jumping jacks. After about 3 jumping jacks, I thought I was dead. So
Yeah.
I spent about 2 weeks up there. And just to finish the story so we don't go back, the Cameron Bay was like a 22-mile long port. I mean, the Navy came in there. That's where we landed when I got in country. That's where all the supplies were done. It was a huge port. And there were units all over. And my particular unit, the 6cc, where I was a hospital unit, carried no weapons, was right on the ocean. And the north end was probably half a mile long, all total. And the north end was just all plywood, and side was a motor pool. And then I don't know if anybody ever saw China Beach, but we were built on the sand with wood walkways like that. And the individual wards, so to speak, were individual buildings, just like on China Beach. Perfect. And then in the middle was a big movie screen that backed up to the ocean, and they had dug seats out of the embankment. And all your administration buildings, your rec hall, your gymnasiums, your medical units, your administrative unit, all that stuff was in the middle. And then the very end of the camp was where you went when you're going to be shipped back to your unit because you're healthy. So this particular night, I was getting ready to ship out. And then actually that morning, as fate would have it, they transferred me from the regular barracks, which we talked about looked like the China Beach ones, down to the transfer because I was going to ship out. Okay, well, that night we went to watch a movie where Eagles Dare with Clint Eastwood, I think it was. I can't remember, but I will never forget the movie. So after the movie, everybody and had some lights out at 9 o'clock. Okay, so everybody headed to where you're going. Of course, now it's a lot of those individual ward units. There were guys in traction, couldn't move, couldn't get out of bed, but those who could walk would come in, and the rest of us, maybe half a dozen, walked down to the very end of the encampment where we're going to be shipping out. So I'm laying in bed and writing a letter to my girlfriend at home. And all of a sudden, on the very other end of the bed, she heard boom, 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 boom. And it was called like walking missiles or walking mortars. And the men said walking, they would come in closer to you with each boom, walking to you. We started to get up and went, let's quiet. They do that all the time. Let's go back to sleep. So no more than maybe a minute later, laid my head back down. There's boom, boom, boom. But these boom booms rattled the glass in our shades. So we knew they were close. So right outside our bunker, or outside our hooch, they had a bunker of sandbags we could go run and get away from the missiles and the mortars. So as I'm running to the door, I talked about those big fans. They're like maybe 2, 3 feet across. As I'm heading to the door, I hear AK weapon fire echoing off the fence. And it meant that they were inside and we had no weapons. So I came out and it was like a 3D movie. The whole north end of the camp was gone. It was all burning. Everything was swelling. All those, there might have been 12 hooches, 6 on each side. They've all flat and burning, and all those guys inside were dead because they couldn't get out of their beds. So I looked at the guy who was next to me. I don't know who he was, couldn't tell you who he was. I said, I'm not going to stand here and die. I'm going to run to the ocean. Let's go to the ocean. It's dark. We're in Cameron Bay. There's people all around us. We know we got about 2 feet in the ocean, and here come the big bunk Hueys just firing their M60s over the horizon and, stop the attack. Well, then they came around and told us they were expecting an attack from the sea. So we dug foxholes. We got us M16s from it because we didn't have any weapons. And we waited for attack that never came. And then they came around about a couple hours later and it's still dark out. They said, okay, there's still some standing buildings. We've got to go and clear them out. No electricity now. They're dark. Looking for suicides or wounded. That was pretty scary. And thank God we didn't find any. But I remember, before we did that, I remember walking back to that bunker and sitting on the bunker and watching this crazy event going on in front of me. Guys are running anywhere, yelling and screaming. Guys running through pieces of wood through their side. It was surrealistic. It was just surrealistic. And I was just sitting there in awe, amazed, or just totally so. Anyway, the next
Yeah.
day, the news agencies came in and interviewed us because we were a hospital unit with no weapons. It was a violation of UN or whatever, Geneva Accords. And they were and because of that, everybody got to make a long distance call home. Nobody said much because it was in the newspapers, and your parents knew where you were. And they say the 6cc was overrun with 90% of casualties. Well, these parents are calling the Army and saying, hey, my son was there. Is he dead? Well, so those of us who were still alive, maybe 25 to 30 of us, got to call home. It was a pretty damn emotional call. And that was my worst night in Vietnam. There were other times, but nothing close to that. But we'll talk later about how they sent us into Cambodia. Well, we couldn't get into Cambodia because we got run down by mud. All our trucks and our track units got stuck in mud. So we had to bivouac in the jungle overnight. Well, I was luckily not on guard duty night, and I slept up against a tree, kind of seed around me on the side and my M16 across my lap so that nobody could sneak up behind me, and I went to sleep. Well, of course, with first light, we're going to get moving to try and get these tracks out of the mud. We got helicopters coming. So as I went to stand up, my right leg, I went to stand and I couldn't stand and the pain was incredible. I couldn't figure out what was gone. So I had a couple guys help me get to sit on the steps of a truck, and I took off my boot, removed my pants, and my shin from my knee to my ankle was swollen about the size of my leg. Didn't know what it was. So they had med-vaced me out. I'm in La La Land area and find out when they get me in the hospital on some morphine that I've been bit by a scorpion. Now, the good news was, if there's such a thing, it bit me in the shin. So the poison went under the skin, but not into my body. Well, the doctor said, we're going to let that ripen and then we'll evacuate it, which probably meant like a pimple getting, we could burst a pimple when you're a kid. So at night, they would tie me down with my arms in bed so I couldn't move because they didn't want me touching, because if something happened to that wound and it burst into my blood, I'm gone. I don't know how long I laid there, 2 or 3 days, and the nurse would come in and give me a little sponge bath on my face and my chest and my arms. And I'm loose in my arms, so that I could stretch a little. And she loosened my arms, and when she pulled the sheets back, which she shouldn't have done, didn't mean to do, I looked at my leg and it was black from my knee to my ankle. And the skin, it was so swollen, the skin was so tight. And I freaked. And I said, no, because I thought I was going to lose my leg. And I hit the side of my shin. And again, God looking over me, the poison broke out instead of in. And it came out like Ready Whip out of a can. It was pea green and it just reeked. The nurse freaked. She immediately ran to the emergency buzzer. And the doctor comes and said, do not move. And he looked at it, he said, you are one lucky man. Otherwise, you'd be dead or not that broken in. So they vacated it out. And it took me a while to get the strength back in the leg and send me back out to the field. And that was the second. First time I was in a field hospital, an attack we talked about one time. I think we talked about it, maybe another episode where they pulled the guns up. We fired point blank with powder only. Not battle. It was raining. And there was a parachute, was saying illumination of like flares up in the air with a parachute. Well, in the rain, it was like a strobe light. Okay. So I'm on the front lines because they've basically gone through our infantry protection and now they're right on our border. I can't remember what it was they wanted me to do, but I had to go back to the communications shack. So I'm running between the hooches because the income is coming on. The hooches are blocking the shrapnel from hitting me. And the light comes on and I see a communication pole. And the space maybe about this wide and running, and then a projectile hit over there, okay, to my left, but was blocked by the building. But the shock made me run between the pole and the building, and it cut my throat right across here on the metal topping of the roof, and I fell down. I don't know how long I laid there, but when I got up in my arm and flare was on, there was blood in the pool, water under me. I guess I was in shock because I get up and I walked to the medic's tent. And again, he said, "You're very lucky you missed your jugular by about a half an inch. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here either." And so they patched that up. Never asked my name. I should have got a Purple Heart for it, but I didn't. But I don't care about that. But so 3 times that one was short because I went right back to duty.
Your position was overrun and your artillery
But this was
sergeant.
this was in Guanaway. And night of June 10th. I'd been in country May 18th. I got country, so I was pretty green yet. And usually in a fire support base, not a fire base, but a fire support base, which is kind of a base camp from a base camp. Okay. Still stuff going on there, but there's a lot of you. An airstrip, you got, Marines, you got, it's a big unit, whereas a fire support base was basically 50 circular meters, and that was about it. And you and about maybe 10 other guys. And that was it. Nobody else. But we were in fire support base. And so when you were in a place like that, you would generally have the infantry have the perimeter in front of the heavy artillery because they didn't want the heavy artillery or even the bombs and the explosives falling in enemy hands because they were big booby traps out of that explosives and stuff. So they were so strong, and there's so many of them, they totally overran the infantry unit in front of us and killed everybody. And now they were at our walls, so to speak. And they're firing M16s out of them. They're not making much progress. And all of a sudden, I'm gone during part of that because I'm in the hospital being treated for the cut. But by the time I get out to the line, he's got the 2 8-inches and the 2 175s lined up, pointing point blank, and maybe the wall was maybe 30 yards away. Okay, that's how close it was. And he ordered everybody to point blank and fire powder only, no projectiles. What's this guy doing? Old guy, master. There's a name for him, not Master Sergeant. I can't remember. It'll come with me. But he had so many stripes that went from his shoulder to his elbow. Old guy knew what he was doing. And when he said fight, all 4 guns fired at once. It sent out this wall of fire. About 50 yards out, the jungle started again, and all those trees lit up like skeletons and burst in fire. And that's what stopped the attack. Otherwise, again, that might not be. But those 3 times. Now you can look at another way. I was 2 months with typhus, 1 month with the scorpion bite. I was 3 months out of the field, 3 months in a comfortable bed with a fan and food and protection. So there's always good and bad, I guess is my.
I mean, how long were you in Vietnam, and start bringing it to the point where you came home and what you had to go through?
Well, you had a mandatory 12-month, 1-year tour to Vietnam. Of course, if you got wounded, seriously could do your job, you got home early. You had a 24-month commitment. So you had 2 months in basic training, you're down to 22. You had 2 months in advanced into training, that would have been where I learned artillery. So now you're down to 20 months. You came home for 30 days, which was the worst 30 days of my life. But anyway, that's another story. And so that means you've got 5 months in, so you've got 19 months left to serve. I left for Vietnam on May 18th, 1969. That's when we left Washington State to fly to Vietnam. And the draft was so controversial at the time, and they're running out of people. I had a guy stand next to me when I was sworn in the first day who was 35 years old. and had 4 kids. So, I mean, they were desperate, especially outstate, because they're just running. They didn't have the body count that the cities did. So for every day that they could get somebody to stay 1 day longer in Vietnam was one less body they needed at home. Plus, we were already trained, and if you'd survived a year over there, you'd learn the ropes, and rather than a new guy coming over and getting killed in the first 30 days. So they started a program that if you extended your tour in Vietnam to the point where you have 1 day less than 5 months left to serve, you could discharge upon landing in the United States. You wouldn't have to serve your last. I wanted the hell out. I don't care what I had to do. So I signed up, and I wound up spending, I think, let's see, I was supposed to go home May 18th. So June, July, August, September, I spent 5 more months. So I spent 17 months over there. And so I signed the papers. And just a little side note, sometimes you do stupid things. And the day I was originally supposed to go, they called me Dero State, and I don't know what that meant. But the day I was supposed to go home, May 17th, that night, I was originally supposed to go home, but I wasn't because I could go home till October now. They woke up us in the middle of the night and sent us into Cambodia. And in the middle of the night, I'm thinking, you stupid idiot, what did you do? Well, I was lucky I got home. On my leave, just a side note, why that's important is that on my leave at home, I went over the campus to say goodbye to people. And I ran into a guy I met maybe the last 6 months of my life at home. His name was Paul Chafee, great guy. And he was a journalism major. And they ran into him on campus. And I'm going to Vietnam, and he looks like he's the end of the world. And I said, Paul, what's going on? I hadn't seen him since I got drafted. He said, well, I graduated. I draft my draft notice. I report in 2 weeks. And my girlfriend's a peacenik, and she broke up with me. So I said, what are you doing tonight? Nothing. Well, I was going to meet 2 girls who were just friends, not girlfriends, at a bar. And I said, why don't you come out? They're both single. Who knows? He wound up marrying one of them. And he wound up becoming an editor on the Grand Rapids Journal in Michigan. And every year when he and Bonnie would come back, they would take me out to dinner for introducing. And after 4 or 5 years, he started to write a book about Vietnam experiences. So he wanted to talk about me. And so we talked for a while, and I gave him some stories, and not stories, but just told him my tale, what I went through. And then I said, well, wait a minute, Paul, what happened to you? I said, what wound up with you? He said, I was so lucky. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I wound up in Seattle. We're flying out the next day to Vietnam, and he was infantry. And he says, and a sergeant opened the door and yelled, anybody here got lifeguard training? I did. So I raised my hand, and they sent me to spend my whole tour of duty in Washington, D.C. as a lifeguard at an officer's pool. And then he said this to me, which was a clutcher. He said, oh, so you spent 2 years there? No, he said, I got the early out. And I said, whoa, time out. What do you mean early out? I said, we were told we had to serve that time in Vietnam. He said, oh, you could have come home, spent 30 days at home, gone back and applied, and they were granting 90% of those extensions at home without having to serve in Vietnam. So, again, interesting. So I guess that kind of was the start of me doubting authorities sometimes. So anyway, so I came home October 17th, 1970.
And we hear about the World War II vets. They went out there as a unit, wherever they were going, where the conflict was. And then when they came home usually on a ship, and they could debrief and be with the people they served with to kind of get more adjusted to society. And Vietnam vets, they were home within a couple of days once they left the jungle, right?
And I walked out of the jungle. In fact, that night, my last night in Vietnam, I was in base camp and came within about 8 inches of dying from friendly fire. But again, the Lord was looking over me. The next morning, they drove me down to Saigon, or Long Binh, or Townsend Air Force Base. And I got on a plane. It was so weird flying over to Vietnam on a Northwest Airlines civilian plane with stewardesses and flying home the same way. So when I got home, it was probably, now I landed in California, Oakland or something like that. I can't remember where. And we had to go through just processing records mostly. And I'll never forget, you couldn't get to a payphone in the plane. Stay on the line because everybody's calling home. I'm home, I made it. Then from that, they bused us to some base. I can't even remember what the name of it was. It was irrelevant. I'm going home. That's all that mattered. And they sent us down to a fantastic state. I mean, everything. steak dinner, welcome back and all that. And there's a recruit, we call him, because he had nice brand new green, probably getting ready to go over. And they had all these 3x3 refrigerator units, maybe 15 on top, 15 on the bottom. He was wiping them out and cleaning them out and had all the doors open. And there's a lot of noise in there, laughing, people eating, happy to be home. And when they were all dry, he came along and he just took his hand, like, start shutting them. And they're going thump, 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 thump. Sounded just like mortars coming in. Everybody hit the
Yeah.
floor. Everybody hit the floor, knocking over tables and everything. And there was just this moment of dead silence. And then somebody said, "Hey, man, we're home. This is bullshit," And then you do realize at that point that you may be home, but you were still there. And then one other thing on the closing. My parents had a big party for me coming home. My girlfriend had basically sent me a Dear John a few months before, but bless her heart that she was there when I got off the airline. And there were some kind of celebrities in the 747 when it landed in Minneapolis. I don't know who, because they held us going up, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people there. And I was probably the only veteran on site. And I'll never forget when that door opened. And I went down the stairs. Her face was the first face I saw of all those people. So anyway, so we went back to my house. All my buddies from the band were there, sports buddies, neighbors, relatives. And I didn't know anybody, because today you have the internet, you can keep up. But when I got on the plane, there was a mental picture image of what home was and what these people were. Well, in 2 years almost, they're going to change. And so you didn't know anybody. And you didn't realize, since you didn't feel you had changed, you didn't realize that they were experiencing the same thing, that they didn't know you anymore and you didn't know them. That was the first step in depression, that sent it down. It wasn't over. It got so bad at one point for me that I was starting to think that I could have never committed suicide, but I thought about it. But that was so bad for me that I thought that, well, maybe those guys that died over there were the lucky ones, because they got it all over once instead of coming home and dying a little bit every day. And you didn't let anybody know you're a veteran, because in those days on the Berettas, the streets of San Francisco, who's the bad guy? Who's the idiot holding up the bank? Vietnam veteran went in F-16. So we never talked about it. The guys from World War II came, as you said, came home on the ship. They had a debriefing. They talked about those experiences. So when they got off the thing, 48 hours earlier, I was in the jungle. Now I'm home. And I didn't go through PTSD. I came home in 70. I didn't go through to until 84. So those are all lost years to me. But I'm lucky. And I feel sorry for myself when I go out for some treatment for some of my Vietnam-related issues. I walk in feeling sorry for myself, and there's a ring of wheelchairs, 8 or 10 of them, guys my age, missing a leg, missing an arm. How can you feel sorry for yourself after that? And that God got you home. Physically, maybe not mentally in one piece, but physically in one piece, which means you could regain your mentality, hopefully.
Art Dean, thank you for sharing, opening up. I know it isn't easy, but it needs to be heard by people. Those of us that didn't serve, weren't put in that position. We don't have any idea. And thanks for giving some clarity to your situation. We did, like I mentioned, 2 shows with you 2 years ago where you talk about Vietnam a bit, but you also talk about your music that helped save you all these years as well. I encourage viewers and listeners to go into my channel and take a look at those. They're really compelling, and art opens up there too, and it needs to be heard. Art Dean, just to wrap this up, thank you so much for coming on My Boomer Buddies podcast. And this is your opportunity to give your final statement of how you're feeling right now and how you're doing.
Well, I developed a new life philosophy. When I was younger and something would go bad, I would say, well, it can always be better. And today I go, it can always be worse, which means it's not so bad now, and it can only get better. Sometimes it doesn't seem real to me at all. But as I said before, if at any point in your life you become satisfied by who you are as a human being, you can't look back and say that anything you did wasn't worth it, because it all made you what you are.
Art, thanks for your friendship. And for Art Dean, I'm Rick Reed, My Boomer Buddies podcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And until next time, we'll see you
Around the block.